In recent weeks, if you've been here in the last few weeks, might remember that the Old Testament, the reading from the Hebrew Scriptures, have focused on Abraham and his wife Sarah. So 2 weeks ago, we heard about God's call on them to leave their home and head to the promised land, and it was promised that Abraham would be the father of many nations. And then last week, you might remember that we heard the story of God coming to Abraham and to Sarah and again renewing this promise that they would have a child, a son, and a promise they found so ridiculous that they both burst out laughing because of their old age. The reading we heard today carries on about a decade plus later. And it picks up the story, but to make sense of it, I need to fill in what's happened between the promise that Abraham and Sarah got last week and what happens in today's story. I'll fill in what's happened in between. Well, in short, God has promised Abraham and Sarah a child, but nothing happened. God was silent for over a decade. No child was born. So Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. And she had an Egyptian slave called Hagar, and she said to Abraham, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Look, Abraham, God's gone quiet. We're not getting any younger. Take my slave Hagar, have a child, and let's raise it as our own. And that way you get your heir and this hope that we have that this child will be that you'll be the father of many nations, that hope will still be alive." It was a cunning plan, but it wasn't God's plan. And it led to all sorts of problems as we start to see the situation unraveling in the reading that we heard today. But I don't think we should be too hard on Sarah, Abraham's wife, because we all have problems waiting for God's plan or promise to be revealed or to be worked out. We've all thought that perhaps there's something we can do just to nudge God along a bit, to work things out in the way that we would like to see them work out. But Sarah's problem was that she forgot that her time frame wasn't the same as God's time frame. That her timing wasn't the same as God's timing. She wanted to rush God. But God had a plan, and God's plan was to be worked out in his appointed time. And one of the things that's interesting in this story to me is that many of the characters, the main characters in it, are so flawed. This is a story about a great hero of the faith, Abraham. A hero of the faith in all the three great monotheistic religions of the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all trace their lineage back to Abraham, the great father of the faith. But here, his actions are far from noble. The consistent character in the story is God. Sarah's act may be selfless, but it was also faithless. She didn't trust that God would work his promise out, so she took matters into her own hands. And Abraham allowed himself to be distracted from what God had said to him, and he settled for second best. Yes, Sarah came up with a plan. They did have a child. But God's plan was that Abraham and Sarah would have a child, and that the lineage would carry on through that child. And at God's appointed time, that did indeed happen. This miraculous son was born, and they called him Isaac, which in Hebrew means laughter, because they found the promise of his birth so laughable. But in God's time, Isaac was born. And that's what's happened just before our reading for today begins. And what we see in today's passage is that it all kicks off at a family celebration. And we know how that goes. Sarah sees Hagar's son as they're there celebrating Isaac's birth. Sarah sees Hagar's son, who's called Ishmael, and he's a teenager now at this point, and he's playing with baby Isaac. And Sarah's consumed with jealousy. "Get this woman and the boy out of my sight," she says to Abraham. And though it distressed Abraham, he did as his wife asked, and Hagar and the boy Ishmael were banished into the wilderness. Abraham sent them off with a bit of bread and a skin of water. And there are many lessons in this great story. We can't address all of them. But one thing it illustrates is that we're all flawed characters, even these great heroes of the faith. To quote Paul's words in the epistle that we also heard read from Romans, we're all enslaved to sin. We're all bound by a human nature and the failings that hold us back. What's consistent in the story is God, and God's consistent, steadfast love for all his people. That's what comes across to me in this story. God remains concerned for Hagar, the banished slave woman. God does not abandon her. His love to her is steadfast. His love, as the psalm reminds us, is kind. Even though Hagar is not the main character in the story, and actually in a way her story and the story of Ishmael could have just been edited out. They're bit part players in a way. They're not the ones carrying God's promise. It's Abraham's son who's the heir, who'll inherit the land. But God remembers Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar's the victim here. She's cast out and discarded, left to her own devices. And when she thought her son Ishmael was dying, she cried out to God, and God answered her. And God made a promise to Hagar that Ishmael, her son, he too would give rise to a great nation. And Hagar is the only woman in the Bible to whom such a promise is made. And in a previous chapter, there was another account recorded between Hagar and God. And Hagar describes God in that passage as one who sees me, which is a very beautiful and unusual description of God. Hagar, the banished slave woman, named God as one who sees me. And God still sees the outcast, the marginalized, the hurting. Hagar knew that, and it gave her comfort as she struggled through problems which had nothing to do with her. None of her problems were of her own making. And this is an amazing story to find in the accounts of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. It follows not the perspective of the householders, but it's told from the perspective of the slave. Not the ones who are awaiting their destiny to be fulfilled by God, but the one who is collateral damage along the way. Hagar is the archetypal mother of every person who's ever been exiled, who's fled violence, every person who's found themselves shunned, trafficked, discarded, forgotten. For Hagar, and for all those like her, our God is one who sees. One who sees me, Hagar says. And I can't talk about this passage without mentioning its importance in another tradition. As I've said, Abraham is important in all the monotheistic religions of the world. And this passage is important in Islam. And it's significant in the Quran, because in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad's lineage is traced back to Ishmael, son of Hagar. So this story of Abraham is a foundational story too in Islam. That's why Abraham is in that tradition regarded as a founding father. So what are we to make of this messy story in which the main characters do not cover themselves in glory? and seem to be wandering away from God's plan. Well, I think it's a great illustration of the fact that God and his love for his people is consistent. It's consistent when they go astray, when they let themselves down, when they let God down. God's love is consistent. He's still working in those people, even in us, to work out his plans in his appointed time. God's love for his people can overcome the obstacles that we ourselves put in our own way, let alone the obstacles that come to us. God is patient with his people. His steadfast love continues in the midst of poor behavior. And that divine love extends to all people. This could be an exclusive story of how God's blessing was restricted to Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. But it's not. It's a story of inclusion. It's a story of God's blessing extending to Hagar and Ishmael. There are no limits to God's love. No one, no people are outside the bounds of God's concern and kindness and love. That's a great theological point that's illustrated for us in baptism. For us, baptism is a symbol of that boundless love that God has for his people. It's a demonstration of his grace, of how his grace extends to all people. And we don't expect a child that we bring for baptism to know all the answers, to say the right things, to have behaved in a certain way, to jump through hoops, because God's love is unconditional. Christ died for all so that we who are baptized are, as St. Paul says, baptized into his death and able to share the power of his resurrection to walk in newness of life. May we all be given that grace and power to walk in God's way, to know that newness of life, to walk at his pace in step with God's appointed timing.